Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to Covered Not Censored, where we talk about social and personal issues affecting the ummah. In this episode, I want to discuss hope for Gaza through a historical and religious lens. Before we get into history, though, I feel it's necessary to speak about the present. Our brothers and sisters in Gaza have been under siege for a year now, the genocide intensifying as schools and tents full of people are bombed, bulldozed, and burned. The recent escalations with Lebanon and Iran have the internet buzzing with fears of a wider regional war. Everything seems to be getting worse, not better. Meanwhile, the world looks away from the horror that Gazans are unable to escape. These people are not numbers, whether that number is 40,000 officially dead, over 100,000 lost under the rubble presumed dead, 15,000 children killed, tens of thousands of children orphaned, close to 100,000 civilians maimed and injured, the West Bank under attack, hundreds killed in Lebanon. Whichever number you choose to focus on, it's not the whole picture. These numbers represent individuals, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, grandparents, aunts and uncles. And while I put the present genocide into the context of history, I'm not forgetting for a moment that these are our Muslim brothers and sisters who are suffering. So before we get into the topic of the episode, I want to ask you to donate through one of the links in the description, inshallah. I'm not an affiliate of any charity, I just want to provide some links for you. Or you can donate to aid through your preferred charity. Please pause the video, go to donate to an aid fund right now, inshallah, and then come back. So, now that we've done that, inshallah, let's put the present into its historical context. Everyone knows about the Crusades. Today in Western literature, the Crusades are still remembered as a heroic Christian jihad, whereas among Muslims, it is remembered as the brutal invasion and occupation, which was eventually ended by our own hero, Salahuddin Ayyubi. In essence, the Crusades were a militant Christian project which aimed not only to occupy Palestine but also to spiritually cleanse it by killing Muslims, Jews, and even some Christians. On a human level, the Crusader invasion was a grotesque and murderous oppression that caused intense suffering. But on the level of cold hard facts, it's important to mention that the Crusader occupation of Jerusalem lasted 89 years in the 12th century, with another span of occupation in the 13th century lasting only 15 years. Sometimes online you might come across people saying the Crusader kingdom lasted almost 200 years, but that's including the span of time when the Crusaders were definitely on the defense, isolated at their last stronghold in Accra, and very much at a disadvantage. But even if we say for the sake of argument that the Crusader kingdom was reigning supreme for 200 years, which of course isn't true, but let's just say this to make a point, even if the Crusaders had been consistently dominant in Palestine for 200 years, that 200 years still came to an end. You see what I mean? A span of 200 years is not the whole span of history. And as simplistic or naive as it may sound, everything does come to an end. Of course, we know how long 1 year can feel, as we watch helplessly from around the world while our Palestinian brothers and sisters are brutalized, and we know the dismay and fear of possible intensification of war. How much longer would 200 years feel if we lived in the middle of that time, our whole lives outlasted by the Crusader occupation? But as permanent as a situation may feel while we're living through it, nothing is eternal except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and no empire, whether evil or good, can last forever. And I have trust in Allah that a time will come when future generations will read in history books about the time when a long-dead regime called Israel was toppled because the world refused to tolerate its crimes any longer. This may sound like wishful thinking or a cope, but it's completely realistic to assume that eventually the Israeli regime will fall, sooner or later. We have an example of this from 1187, when Salahuddin liberated Jerusalem from the 89 years long Crusader occupation. We find other examples of militant liberation in the Algerian Revolution, the Indonesian War of Independence. Civil disobedience and vandalism were employed by South Africa's anti-apartheid movement, which got the activists labeled as terrorists until they eventually succeeded. There are even examples of resistance from Europe during the Second World War, such as the French resistance to Nazi occupation, when many French civilians became spies and saboteurs, feeding information to foreign allies until those allies could come defeat the Germans. We can also find peaceful forms of resistance in history, such as the Underground Railroad in the United States, where enslaved African Americans organized escape routes to freedom in the North, while many others endured slavery for generations until the eventual abolition of slavery. Here in Canada, where I live, the Indigenous people suffered horribly in the residential schools, where children were beaten, abused, and even killed just for speaking their own language. But they endured, and eventually the schools closed, and now they're relearning their languages and their cultures. Throughout history and around the world, all types of people have persevered and endured in the face of oppression, striving for a day when their children will know liberation. Believers have an advantage over disbelievers when being oppressed, though, and that advantage is the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, some Zionists and enemies of Islam online are using this genocide to mock the deen, saying God isn't with the Palestinians, or that he's punishing them for standing against their oppressors. But what these vile critics clearly don't understand is how Allah manifests his love and blessings onto his believers. In Islam, we know that hardships are not a punishment for believers, but a blessing. There's one hadith in Bukhari: if Allah wills good for someone, he afflicts him with trials. In another hadith narrated by Tirmidhi, we're told, when Allah loves a people, he tests them, and whoever accepts it attains his pleasure, whereas whoever shows discontent with it incurs his wrath. And in the Qur'an, God himself tells us, verily we shall put you to test with some fear and hunger and with some loss of wealth, lives, and offspring. And O Muhammad, convey good tidings to those who are patient, who say, when afflicted by hardship, verily we are of God, and verily to him we shall return. Upon them is the blessings of Allah and his mercy. So as Muslims, we know that for believers, hardship is a sign of Allah's love, his blessings, and his mercy. Through their suffering, the Palestinians are being raised in ranks and gaining access to the highest level of heaven, Jannat al-Firdaus. And the rest of us are also being tested. Our trial being, what will we do about it? Allah will judge us for how we react to the suffering of our brothers and sisters. So to those who protest, keep protesting. To those who boycott, keep boycotting. To those who write letters, keep letter writing. To those who give financial aid, keep donating. But beyond that, we also have a duty to Allah, and that is to trust him and to be patient. Because like it says in the Qur'an verse I just quoted, convey good tidings to those who are patient, who say when inflicted by hardship, verily we are of God and verily to him we shall return. Here Allah is instructing people to make the well-known dua, inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, and he's also telling us to be patient, and by doing these things we can be granted his blessings and his mercy. When I put the ongoing genocide into a historical context, and when I say that nothing lasts forever, and when I remember the success of previous liberation movements around the world, I'm trying to encourage patience, and to practice patience myself, inshallah. Patience doesn't exclude action, but it does require trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. With that in mind, I'd like to remind you to donate to Aid for Palestine if you didn't earlier, and also continue making dua for them every day, their martyrs and their survivors alike. I hope this episode has been a source of hope and encouragement, inshallah. And until the next one, Assalamu alaikum.